Don't make a sound, the girl whispered. They don't know I'm still here. Arthur Voss heard those words before he saw her face. He had just stepped off the elevator on the 42nd floor of the Whitmore building. His building, the one he had spent 31 years turning from a struggling regional firm into one of the most respected corporate law practices in the mid-Atlantic, and a child was crouched behind the marble reception desk in the dark, pressing one finger to her lips like her life depended on it. He almost spoke, almost called out, but something in her eyes stopped him. She was not playing. She was not lost. She was hiding from something, and whatever it was still close. Arthur lowered himself slowly, his knees protesting the way they always did now that he was 63, and he moved behind the desk beside her. The lobby was dark. After 7 in the evening, the overhead lights clicked off automatically, leaving only the ambient glow of the city coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In that pale gray light, he could see her clearly. She was maybe 10 years old. Dark braids, a school uniform, blue plaid skirt, white collar, with one sock pulled up and one fallen down. She had been here a while. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Ivy," she said. "I came with my dad. He works in the mailroom. He forgot his phone and brought me back to get it, and then—" She stopped, swallowed. "There are men in your office, Mr. Voss." "2 of them. I heard one of them say your name." Arthur stayed very still. "What else did you hear?" Ivy looked at him the way children look at adults when they are deciding whether to trust them with something too large for them to carry alone. Then she said, "He said tonight was the last time anyone would have to worry about you." 3 weeks earlier, Arthur Voss had made the single most consequential decision of his professional life. He had agreed to testify. The case had started as a routine securities matter. A mid-size pharmaceutical company, Caldwell Dynamics, accused of misrepresenting clinical trial data to investors before a major stock offering. Arthur's firm had done work for Caldwell years ago, routine contract reviews, nothing that touched the fraud. But in the process of that old engagement, a junior associate had flagged something in a memo and passed it to Arthur, and Arthur, being Arthur, had kept a copy. The memo showed that Owen Merritt, founder, CEO, and the kind of man who got his name on hospital wings, had personally signed off on the decision to suppress negative trial results. Not a rogue accountant, not a compliance failure. Owen Merritt himself, in black ink, on a document dated 4 years before the offering that had cost ordinary investors somewhere north of $200 million. The federal prosecutor's office had come to Arthur quietly in September. They needed a credible witness who could authenticate the memo, explain the chain of custody, and withstand what would certainly be a vicious cross-examination by Merritt's legal team. Arthur had spent 6 days thinking about it. He had talked to no one, not his senior partner, not his ex-wife, not his daughter who called him every Sunday from Portland. He had sat in his office after hours and looked at the city below him and thought about what kind of man he wanted to be when this was over. He agreed on a Thursday. By the following Monday, he was certain that someone had told Owen Merritt. The first sign was small. His car, a dark blue sedan he'd owned for 4 years, had been moved in the parking garage. Not much, 6 inches to the left. He had a parking habit his daughter teased him about, of leaving exactly 2 feet between his driver's door and the yellow line. He noticed immediately. He said nothing and drove home a different route. The second sign was less small. His office had been entered. Nothing was taken. But Arthur had a system, a private system that would have looked like paranoia to anyone else, of leaving certain documents at specific angles on his desk before he left each evening. A yellow legal pad at a slight diagonal, a client folder with the tab facing precisely left. When he came in the following morning, the pad was straight. The folder tab faced right. Someone had gone through his desk, tried to restore it, and had not known the original positions. He copied everything to an external drive that day and stored it somewhere that was not his office and not his home. The third sign was Owen Merritt himself, who called Arthur directly on a Wednesday afternoon, which he had absolutely no legitimate reason to do, and said in a voice made of practiced warmth that he hoped there were no hard feelings about the old Caldwell engagement, that these things sometimes got complicated, and that he had always respected Arthur enormously. Arthur thanked him, hung up, sat for a long time looking at nothing. He told his assistant he would be working late that Thursday evening. He sent her home at 5. He intended to review the files one more time before turning them over to the prosecutor's office on Friday morning. He had not planned on Ivy. Behind the reception desk, Arthur listened. The building had its own nighttime sounds, the hum of the HVAC, the distant percussion of the elevator cables. But underneath those sounds, there was something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway that led to his office. "How many?" he whispered. "2, Ivy said. "One was on the phone, one was just waiting. Did they see you?" She shook her head. "I was in the supply closet getting my dad's phone." The door was open a little. I could see through the crack. Where's your father now? He went down to the loading dock. He said he'd be back in 5 minutes, and that was a long time ago. Her voice was steady, but her hands were pressed flat against her thighs in the way that people press their hands down when they are trying not to shake. Arthur thought quickly. His phone was in his jacket pocket. He could call the police, but if these men were professionals, and the way Merritt operated suggested they would be, a call would alert them before help arrived. He needed to get Ivy out first, then himself. Then he needed to get to a place where he could make the call from safety. There's a stairwell at the end of this hall, he whispered. The door is heavy, but it doesn't latch loudly if you press the handle down before you push. I need you to trust me. Ivy looked at him. Do you know why they're here? He considered lying. She was 10 years old, but she had already heard more than most adults would have handled calmly, and she had kept her head, and he thought that lying to her now would be a particular kind of wrong. I think I do, he said. I'm going to explain everything once we're safe. I promise. She nodded, once, the way her father had probably taught her to nod when she meant it. They moved. Arthur had walked that hallway 10,000 times. He knew which section of carpet ran over a subfloor seam and made a sound if you stepped in the middle rather than to the left. He knew that the third ceiling panel from the elevator had a loose bracket that vibrated faintly when the HVAC kicked on, and he knew that it would kick on at 7:14 because it always did, and when it did, the small ambient noise would cover their movement for approximately 40 seconds. He watched the clock on his phone screen. 7:12. 7:13. At 7:14, he touched Ivy's shoulder and they moved down the hallway, staying close to the left wall, stepping over the seam without a word because he had already shown her where it was. The stairwell door was 20 feet ahead. The light under his office door, his office, where he had spent 3 decades of his life, was a thin gold line against the dark hallway floor. Shadows passed across it twice. They reached the door. Arthur pressed the handle down slowly the way he had described and pushed, and it opened with no sound at all, and they were through. The stairwell was cold and smelled of concrete and emergency lighting. Ivy gripped the railing. They went down without speaking. 42 floors is a long way, but Arthur set a pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough that neither of them would stumble. And somewhere around the 28th floor they heard, far above them, a door open. Ivy looked up. Arthur put a hand on her back and they kept moving. They came out through the building's service exit onto a side street that smelled of exhaust and November cold. Arthur walked her half a block to a diner with bright windows and a woman at the counter who looked like she had seen everything and would not be moved by any of it. He sat Ivy down in a booth. He ordered her hot chocolate without asking. He sat across from her and called 911, and then he called the federal prosecutor's office, the direct number, the one he had memorized in September. Then he sat back and looked at the girl across the table, this child in a school uniform with one sock up and one sock down who had been afraid and had stayed quiet and had made exactly the right choice in a situation that would have paralyzed most adults. And he said, "Your father is probably very worried about you." "He's going to be so relieved," Ivy said. "And then he's going to be so mad." Arthur laughed. It came out of him unexpectedly, the way real laughter does, and for a moment the weight of the last 3 weeks lifted slightly, the way a storm front lifts before it fully breaks. "That's how you know someone loves you," he said. She seemed to consider this seriously. "Is that true?" "In my experience." Her father's name was Desmond. He came through the diner door. 11 minutes later, coat open and face drawn tight with the specific terror of a parent who has lost a child in a building and does not know where they are. He saw Ivy in the booth and stopped walking. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hand on the door frame, and Arthur watched something move through the man's face. Relief, then gratitude, then the anger Ivy had predicted, and then Desmond crossed the diner floor and pulled his daughter into his arms and held her without saying anything for a long time. When he finally straightened up and looked at Arthur, he said, "What happened?" Arthur told him everything. The police found 2 men in Arthur's office. One was a former private investigator with a record of contract work that the detectives described, carefully, as irregular. The other carried no identification at all. They had not touched anything in the office. They had been waiting, as Ivy had said, and whatever they had been waiting to do, they had not done it. But the prosecutor's office moved quickly, and by the following morning there were warrants being served in places considerably more expensive than a 42nd floor office in downtown Baltimore. Owen Merritt's attorney issued a statement at 9 a.m., saying that his client had no knowledge of any individuals in the Whitmore building and that the allegations were entirely without basis. By noon, 3 of Merritt's senior associates had retained separate counsel. By 3 in the afternoon, the statement had been withdrawn. Arthur watched this from the federal building, where he had been since 7 in the morning, drinking bad coffee and giving a very long statement that covered the memo, the chain of custody, the parking garage, the desk, and the phone call on a Wednesday afternoon made by a man who had wanted him to know, without saying so, that he had been noticed. His attorney sat beside him. At one point, during a break, she leaned over and said quietly, "You know, most people would have left the building." "There was a child," Arthur said. She looked at him. "You didn't know there was a child when you decided to stay," he thought about that. She was right. Technically, he had decided not to leave before he had found Ivy. He had decided not to leave, because leaving meant abandoning 31 years of work, and the people who depended on it, and the investors who had lost their savings, and the particular memo that had been sitting in his possession for 4 years waiting for someone to use it correctly. But he did not say any of that. He said, "I suppose I didn't." The trial began the following April. Arthur testified for 2 days. Merritt's defense team was as good as expected and as relentless as feared, and Arthur sat in the witness box and answered every question carefully and completely, without embellishment and without retreat. The memo was authenticated, the chain of custody held. The jury deliberated for 3 days and returned a verdict on a Thursday afternoon. Arthur was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. He was in his office, the same office where 2 men had waited for him in the dark, which he had kept, because leaving it would have meant letting something be taken from him that he was not willing to give. His assistant knocked on the door at 2:47. She did not say anything. She just looked at him, and he read the answer in her face. He nodded once and went back to the brief he had been reviewing. Desmond brought Ivy to the office one Saturday in May. She had asked to come, Desmond said. She had something she wanted to say. Arthur cleared his schedule, which, on a Saturday, was not difficult. Ivy stood in his office and looked around at the bookshelves and the framed photographs and the window that looked out over the city, and she said, "This is nice." "I think so," Arthur said. "My teacher said what I did was brave." She said this in the tone of someone who had been told a thing so many times she was no longer sure what to do with it. "What do you think?" Arthur asked. Ivy was quiet for a moment. "I think I was scared. I don't know if that's the same as brave." Arthur considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary Saturday way. Traffic below, a siren somewhere distant, the particular blue of a May sky over downtown Baltimore. "I've been practicing law for 31 years, he said. "I've known a lot of people who called themselves brave. Most of them weren't scared enough for it to mean anything." He paused. "Being scared and doing the right thing anyway, that's the whole definition. That's all it is." Ivy looked at him. She was the kind of child who listened to what adults said and actually processed it, rather than simply waiting for them to finish, and he could see her turning this over. "Okay," she said finally. Desmond caught Arthur's eye over his daughter's head, and something passed between them. The wordless acknowledgement of 2 people who have been through something together that they will not fully explain to anyone else and do not need to. Arthur walked them to the elevator. Before the doors closed, Ivy turned around and looked at him with the directness that children have before the world teaches them to look away. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I'm glad you were working late." The doors closed. Arthur stood in the hallway for a moment, in the building he had spent 31 years building, in the silence that follows when something important has just finished. Then he walked back to his office, sat down at his desk, legal pad at a slight diagonal, client folder with the tab facing precisely left, exactly as he had always kept it, and went back to work.